Hey everyone, so Rajiv already introduced me, so yeah, here I am. I'm here to talk about fuzzing. Those of you who know Sigma Prime probably know that we're really big fans of this security testing technique, and we've been applying it for quite some time now to various projects, including the Ethereum consensus layer. So I'll talk briefly about who we are, what we do. We're headquartered in Sydney, but we've been hiring people all around the globe. We're about 25 people, so relatively small-ish team dedicated to the blockchain security world, really. There's kind of two divisions. I head up the security assessment services arm of the business. I put up a few of our clients' logos. I'm sure some of them are familiar to you guys. But we're also the founders and maintainers of Lighthouse, the Rust implementation of the Ethereum consensus layer. So this started as a little side project by my co-founder, Paul, and has turned into this massive beast responsible for securing billions and billions of value. It's the second most used consensus client after Prism. It's picking up steam. It's focused on security, kind of natural considering the DNA of the company. It's heavily optimized for performance, and it's free and open source. And it started about 4 years ago now. Crazy. The Beacon chain. Most of you know, I'm sure, that we have 5 production clients. So Lighthouse in Rust, Lodestar in TypeScript, Nimbus in Nim, Prism in Go, and Teku in Java. So a whole heap of different programming languages that we get to play with as part of our fuzzing efforts. And I'm sure you know that we've had a Beacon chain now for quite some time. It's launched on December 1st, 2020. And I'd argue that it's been quite successful. I remember a bunch of people on the internet being really worried that we wouldn't reach the threshold required to activate the actual Beacon chain a few days before the launch. We obviously got there, and we now have about very close to 10% of the total ETH supply staked in Ethereum, which is pretty cool. So if you've been involved in the Beacon chain, if you've been validating since Genesis, you should have made, as of today, about 3.1, 3.2 Ether, depending on which client you use, depending on how many proposals you got. If you got any slashings as well, they do impact your profitability heavily. So yeah, about 100,000 ETH rewarded, I guess, over the past few months. Cool, so let's dive into fuzzing. Bunch of you guys, I'm sure, are very familiar with this testing technique. It's just essentially the process of submitting a whole heap of randomized inputs to a certain software. And monitoring for abnormal behavior, software crashes, panics, and things like that. So yeah, it sounds very simple, but there's a lot of different layers to it, right? So you can basically pick a function, hit that function with a million numbers of different inputs, and monitor for anything that is behaving differently than what the developers have intended. You can take that approach to another level. When you have several implementations of the same specification, you can perform differential fuzzing. So instead of fuzzing all these software like individually and separately, you can basically provide them with the same input and compare the output. This is particularly interesting when you have, as I said, multiple implementations in different languages, some of them perhaps heavily optimized, other not so much, of the same spec. And this is critical in identifying consensus logic flaws. And this is basically what we've been doing with Beaconfuse, the differential fuzzing framework for the consensus layer. A bunch of icons here are no longer really a thing. So Trinity was the Python implementation maintained by the Ethereum Foundation. That's long gone now. Serenity, I don't know if Proto is in the room, but it's Proto's baby. And I heard actually earlier this week that he's reviving it and giving it a second life. So this is what we've been doing essentially, using Beaconfuse as an orchestrator to hit all these clients and compare the output of their state transition functions to essentially identify potential discrepancies and deviances from the spec. So Beaconfuse itself, just a quick history of the project. In March 2019, Guido Vranken Martin mentioned him earlier. Martin's very familiar with his work. Had started this project, and he named it kind of ETH 2.0 fuzzing. That was simply C++ orchestration, basically with libfuzzer, with limited set of targets and functions covered. But he managed to find a whole heap of bugs within a few days, right? Guido perhaps lost a bit of interest in the project and kind of moved on to other things, but the Ethereum Foundation was really, really keen on having someone, some entity, pick up this effort, revive it, and really extend it to the extent where we would add, all clients, all state transition functions. So that's what we've done. We were granted a grant from the EF in 2019, in September 2019, and we started by extending the project and, adding more clients, more functions, more fuzzing engines, and finding new bugs. So that was fun, but we really quickly kind of realized the limitations of the existing framework and decided to redesign it completely, revamp it completely, and rewrite it in Rust. So this is what Beaconfuse really is. So Beaconfuse, the project itself, is really a collection of different fuzzing frameworks and fuzzing tools. So I'll go through those three sort of green boxes are the three main components of Beaconfuse. The first one is ETH2Fuzz, and that's really our standalone coverage-guided fuzzer, right? So this targets each implementation separately. For each client, we would write fuzzers that would first target the state transition functions, and that would be coverage-guided, meaning that we can support a whole bunch of different engines. libfuzzer is kind of the default one, the go-to fuzzing engine, but we've been experimenting with AFL, HonkFuzz. Obviously, when dealing with Java clients, we kind of need like a specific fuzzing engine, so we've played with JQF. That was particularly slow. I think we were getting about 10, 15 executions per second. That's really slow in fuzzing. And we were kind of saved by Jazzer that was released later on, late last year, which speeds up things really, really considerably. And the idea is to essentially come up with a set of valid inputs, right? So you want to fetch beacon states that are valid. You want to fetch beacon blocks, proposer slashings, attestations, etc., from the spec tests, from test nets, from mainnet even these days, and feed that to these fuzzing engines. And you essentially instruct those fuzzing engines to perform their mutations, and just produce these inputs, send them to the right functions, and hopefully for us, get some crashes. And that's what happened. But the thing is, if you don't include any structural fuzzing, I'll explain what this means in a bit, you essentially keep hitting the serialization, the marshalling, unmarshalling, right? And most of the bugs that ETH2Fuzz fuzzers have been able to find are on SSZ. And SSZ is the serialization format that we use in the consensus layer. It's very hard to get right, I'd say. Every single client had critical vulnerabilities on their SSZ implementations over the past couple of years. Not a single one was sort of flawless. So it's difficult to get right because we got like dynamic lists, dynamic types. So yeah, pretty tricky stuff. So don't get me wrong, it's really good that we can pick up these bugs on the SSZ level, on the serialization level, but we're really interested in hitting the state transitions. So how do we do that? Structural fuzzing, right? So there's this beautiful thing called the arbitrary trait in Rust, which if you derive it for classic types or implement it yourself for complex types, gives the ability for libfuzzer sys, not getting into too many details, it's a Rust crate that essentially instructs your fuzzing engines to conform to a certain grammar, right? So you have your structs that are, in some cases, quite complex in the ETH2 world, Ethereum consensus world. And so you basically derive that trait or implement it yourself, and then your fuzzers are like, okay, cool, I now need to comply with this set of rules. And that allowed us to, as I said, hit state transition functions and dramatically increase our coverage. So the type of bugs we've identified, a whole heap of panics on the serialization, as I mentioned, so things like memory exhaustions, nil-pointed dereferences, out-of-band memory accesses. As David mentioned yesterday, denial of service vulnerabilities in these contexts are pretty bad, right? Like if I can come up with a certain packet and just broadcast it to the network and take offline perhaps the whole network or a majority of it, we're in trouble, right? So we treat DOS conditions as extremely serious and critical. A whole bunch of interesting panics as well. What happens when you put in your ENR non-UTF-8 characters, like emojis and whatnot? Some clients didn't really like that. So yeah, a whole heap of different bugs have been identified through ETH2Fuzz. The other component I'd like to briefly mention is ETH2Diff. And to be honest, I wouldn't even call that a fuzzing tool, really. It's more of a debugging tool. It's a wrapper around a bunch of client utilities that implementers have made available to us. So thank you so much to all the client teams who have worked with us over the past years to provide us with this super useful tooling. And we basically, when we pick up an interesting input with ETH2Fuzz, for a specific client, we want to observe the behavior of that input for all the other clients, right? So if we get like a memory leak or just like a hang, a timeout, it might be something interesting as well for other clients. So this allows us to very, very simply, just test those other clients and replay essentially those samples across all of them. And it's been really, really interesting. You'd think you wouldn't find much using that, but we did find a lot. And I think perhaps one of my favorite bugs that we've found is the last one I mentioned in this slide. We found a way on a client, which shall remain unnamed, to mint Ether in the Beacon chain without actually depositing it in the deposit contract. So that was quite fun, essentially bypassing the whole Merkle root verification at the Beacon chain level. So that was cool. And then Beaconfuse V2, which is, I'd say, where most of the value add is. This is where we perform our differential dynamic fuzzing. So using foreign function interfaces, FFI bindings. This is written in Rust, right? So if you're hitting Lighthouse, you're sweet. You just import the crate. It's a native call, no worries. But how do you do that? How do you call, Go functions, Java functions, JavaScript functions from Rust code? And the answer is FFIs. It's good, it's modular, but it's very slow, right? And when you have 5, 6 different clients, all of a sudden your fuzzing architecture just gets out of hand, and it takes a while to build, a while to execute. But it's super effective at catching consensus bugs. We found a whole heap of off-by-one errors in the state transition functions, which could cause an actual consensus split on the network. So really bad stuff that we were able to catch using this fuzzing technique. Another one which was cool, so as I said, we're focusing on state transitions, but we've also done a bit of work on the BLS signatures that have been used, and one of our teammates have found a really interesting signature malleability vulnerability on the most used BLS library. So that was cool. That, as you can imagine, that got patched really quickly. So just, again, give you a quick overview of what we've been finding. Every single client had bugs, right? Even Lighthouse, and that was fun. Some of them, as I said, were really, really critical and could have taken down the network very easily. The distribution per fuzzing tool, as I said, ETH2Fuzz allowed us to spot a whole heap of denial of service conditions. Beaconfuse V2 about 9 to 10. Interesting, most of them critical consensus splitting bugs, and then the replayer or ETH2Diff was also instrumental in catching some of those. So, yeah, a lot of cool stuff. I kind of rushed through all of it so that we can have time for questions. There's a bunch of ongoing work. As David mentioned, we're actually fuzzing as we speak the Bellatrix branches of all the Ethereum consensus clients, getting ready for the merge, and yeah, hopefully catching some nasty bugs before they hit production. Thank you.